This is Mumia Abu Jamal, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Enjoy.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
And our producer, the indomitable Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, indomitable Steve.
Oh, no, I'm not looking for a return. Well, we have the real indomitable one, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. Well, the show has its sadness, its terrifying aspects, as well as its optimistic incursions. Stay tuned.
Yes, Ralph. And first up, we return to the topic of artificial intelligence. This time, we're going to focus on some of the facets of our lives being disrupted by AI: education, law enforcement, and human companionship, among others. To discuss how the tendrils of AI are creeping into our society and economy, we welcome J.B. Branch, who is the Big Tech Accountability Advocate for Public Citizens Congress Watch Division. He leads public citizens' advocacy efforts on AI accountability, consumer data and privacy rights, tech product safety, platform oversight, and how to protect children online. All this AI stuff is moving very fast, and J.B. Branch is here to help us catch up. Then we welcome in person someone you hear every week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. He joins us today to talk about the latest issue of the Capitol Hill Citizen. Finally, we close with a tribute to the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Ralph is going to share some of his thoughts and memories of the late civil rights icon. But first, everywhere we turn, there's a new AI tentacle creeping up on us. How can we get a handle on it? David?
J.B. Branch is the Big Tech Accountability Advocate for Public Citizens Congress Watch Division. He leads public citizens' advocacy efforts on artificial intelligence accountability, consumer data and privacy rights, tech product safety, platform oversight, and child online safety protections. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, J.B. Branch.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Welcome, JB. We're going to start from scratch here, sort of like a tutorial, because a lot of people hear about AI, and the descriptions are not fundamental. Often they assume, well, there's a basis of knowledge here. Let me start by saying there's nothing new about artificial intelligence. A thermostat is artificial intelligence. Automated machinery in factories, artificial intelligence. The original artificial intelligence is the corporation itself. It's called an artificial person. What we're talking about is generative artificial intelligence. That's where the risks, the dangers, the potential, the threat to the world comes from. Can you describe it?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. So, artificial intelligence really refers to technology that is intended to simulate human intelligence. It does that by using vast amounts of data to basically run a statistical algorithm and come up with a probabilistic guess as to what someone wants as the answer. And so that's what general artificial intelligence is. When we're talking about generative artificial intelligence, that is sort of taking it the next step. That is a large language model or a product that can create things really based on user prompts. So a user might say, create an image of Pac-Man on a horse, or might say, write a love letter to my partner. And the generative artificial intelligence takes what it knows about the user and all the data that it has and creates a whole new response based on what the user was requesting.
Given all this, the companies who are attaching their artificial intelligence to generative artificial intelligence becomes a double menace. And what we're seeing is a massive propaganda campaign, such as 3 advertisements on the Super Bowl recently, trying to make artificial intelligence of the regenerative type nice and comfortable. Everything's going to come out very well, very positive. It's going to discover new medicines. It's going to make the economy more efficient. It's going to create all kinds of innovation. So there's a real one-sided propaganda. And at Public Citizen, you are looking at the dark side. You're looking at the unregulated side. You're looking at the costs that already are being imposed on, for example, jobs being replaced. So tell us about a sort of clueless Congress here. You know, they have these hearings and they ask these questions and they just get nothing done. Generative artificial intelligence is feared by conservatives, by liberals. There have been attempts at state legislatures to curb its impact on children, which we'll get to in a moment. But Congress still hasn't passed much of anything at all. Give us the scene.
Yeah, well, really what's happening is these AI companies are kind of taking a page out of the playbook of the social media days. When social media was brand new, they were trying to say that this technology is going to lead to people being more connected, it's going to lead to efficiencies, it's going to lead to just overall positives. And in fact, there were times where you had big tech CEOs who were saying that a lot of this money was going to trickle down. And you look down and you look up, and I'm not any richer because Facebook stock is soaring or Microsoft's is soaring. What we're really seeing is the same thing that's happened with these large tech companies, which is that they promise the world, they offer back very little. And in fact, what they offer up is a series of harms. You're starting to see parental groups who are wising up to it after social media harms that have been unleashed on kids. Kids are now, more depressed than previous generations. And now you have this automated AI, which can really ramp things up 10 times, 100 times fold. There are promises that AI is going to help the economy. What we're seeing is that a lot of these tech CEOs are trying as hard as possible to ensure that these AI systems are replacing workers. So what's going to happen when those folks are laid off? Tech companies are laying off coders, but you also see this in stores with these sort of like automated checkout systems. Those are real jobs that people have that are going to be replaced by AI. Congress has been really bought into AI. They're buying into this idea that it's a race for the world between us and China. So you have some congressional folks who believe that this is a race against China and that we need to harness this weapon. And then you have a lot of corporate money from these AI companies. You just mentioned the Super Bowl ads, which cost a pretty penny, but they're dumping a lot of money into races, congressional races, to ensure that they're propping up candidates who align with this deregulatory scheme. And quite frankly, the American people want regulations because they saw what happened when social media was left unregulated. You can't trust these companies to regulate themselves, and you can't trust that they're going to hold their word to their promises because we've seen all the harms that they've unleashed, including disinformation and harms on minors, like you alluded to earlier.
Well, there's a recent article in the New York Times, February 12th, titled AI Companies Are Eating Higher Education. They're eating higher education. And the reporter, Matthew Connolly, goes on to say, young people are quickly becoming so dependent on AI that they're losing the ability to think for themselves. And rather than rallying resistance, academic administrators are aiding and abetting a hostile takeover of higher education. And the companies are pouring money into these universities, promising cash bonuses when students meet marketing goals, creating conflicts of interest, especially when these students who are paid are elected to positions in student government. This is news to me. I mean, I didn't know the penetration was so deep. Can you elaborate on this?
Right. Well, part of this has to do with the business model that a lot of these companies bank on, which is basically trying to capture or corner a market. So what they try to do is they offer free services or free software in a variety of ways. In this example, it's students. What they're banking on is if we give you our AI system for free to the next class of graduating students, they're going to be dependent on our system and they're going to use our system, not just now, but moving forward when they become adults and enter the workforce, they're going to feel most familiar with the system that they've used first. And there's actually a lot of research that supports this notion. If you're an iPhone user and that was your first phone that you ever had, the likelihood is you're going to be an Apple user and an iPhone user because it's what you feel most comfortable with. The problem with this in the educational system is that, college is really supposed to be a time where metal sharpens metal. You're supposed to be really thinking for yourself for the first time, exploring your ideas, and challenging one another organically. But what happens with AI is that students, they end up feeding their essay questions into the generative models, and it spits back what some folks are referring to as kind of AI slop. When we started talking earlier, I mentioned that it's all statistics that these AI models are generating out. And what a lot of professors are finding is that if they ask a specific question to a class, those students are using AI, and those essays all start to seem very similar to one another. That's because the AI models are using statistics to create a probabilistic guess to determine what that professor means or wants when they ask that specific question. And it's really hard for these professors to call these students out. In fact, there was one professor who did what is referred to as the Trojan horse method in trying to determine if his students were cheating, which was that he asked a question on a Word document, but in really small font text that was invisible to the students, he had specific prompts and verbiage that was used. And the reason he did that was so that when students turned in their assignments, if any of those verbiages that were invisible to the naked eye came up, it could be read by an AI system. And what he found out was almost half of his class turned in papers that had nonsense that was completely unrelated to the prompt, which had to do with that Trojan horse sort of security method.
Yeah.
It's a real problem.
Well, the Times article, JV, says that research suggests that students using AI do not read as carefully when doing research, and that they write with diminished accuracy and originality, and they ask fewer questions. So it's spreading everywhere. There's a preliminary study in England where doctors are using AI so frequently that their own skills are starting to atrophy. And I can see that with other professions as well. So back to Congress. What do you recommend as the technology accountability staff for Congress Watch? What do you recommend? Give us your ideal congressional legislation to deal with generative AI.
Yeah, the dream, if Congress would listen to me. I think it starts off with treating AI just like any other industry. Why should it be any different from other industries? We have regulations that are in place. We have regulations on automotive industries, aviation. So we need regulations on AI. Some of those regulations would include ensuring that products are safe when they go to market. That's a pretty standard recommendation. We're seeing that some of these systems are going out to market. They're creating sexualized images of children, of women. That product should never go to market. There are other products that are encouraging teens to die by suicide or harm themselves, or even drug usage. Again, there should be regulations testing these products before they go onto market. Another sort of common sense principle is if there are mass harms that are occurring, companies need to be fined, and government regulators need to have a way to step in and intervene. We just saw this situation with Grok, Elon Musk's large language model that created 3 million deep fake pornography images of women and thousands of children. And while it was happening, it was allowed to stay on the market because there was no mechanism to take it off. And Google and Apple were still making it available to teens. If something like that is happening, the federal government should be able to intervene and pause it from being available to consumers. And there should be a massive fine coming to the way of Elon Musk and X.
Obviously, you favor AI self-identifying itself. Anytime there's an AI, it has to describe itself as AI. Isn't that correct?
Right. So that's another issue. A lot of times individuals are interacting with chatbots and they don't realize that it's AI. And so disclosures are incredibly important as well. Talking about the elections that are going to be coming up in 2026, we anticipate an explosion of AI used in political campaigning. Whenever that's happening, there needs to be disclosures. There needs to be ways to verify things because we're increasingly moving to this like post-truth world where people can't distinguish fact from reality. And there have been a couple of times in Europe where pro-Putin candidates have benefited from Russians injecting their elections with misinformation and disinformation that was AI generated. That's not something that President Trump is taking seriously. He's cutting funding to CISA, but he also is helping with the spread of disinformation through AI generated images. So that's obviously a huge concern for us too.
Well, given the history of spotty regulation or non-regulation by regulatory agencies over the drug companies, the auto companies, the fossil fuel polluters, JB, do you really think that's going to do much other than pick off a few outrageous violators where thousands of more violators come in every day and there's no national barrier against this? They can come from anywhere in the world. Don't you think a more generic confrontation has to occur here? For example, the first trial on what artificial intelligence has done to teenagers, and not to mention preteens, is occurring now in Los Angeles against the big Silicon Valley companies. And there are countries like Australia and others banning access to these systems by any youngster 16 or under. So what about the approach of prohibition here? Selective prohibition, age prohibition. Where are you on that?
Right. So I think that bans have a place to play, particularly for teens, because many of these products have an emotive component to it. There have been several AI companions that have been released onto market, which are these products that basically try to replicate the feeling of a friend or a lover. And it has caused what some folks are referring to as AI psychosis, where people believe whatever these things are saying and they create unhealthy relationships with these products. So, in those instances, a ban for teens in particular would be incredibly helpful. Problem is that, as anyone who's been a kid can attest, kids find ways to get into things that they shouldn't have access to. And so, the remedies that some of these companies have created are facial recognition or uploading your license onto their websites. And that opens up a whole other can of worms for other users in terms of privacy rights. But a ban would be, for teens in particular, would be a good first step because we've already seen the harms that have befallen kids through social media when these companies have said that they would regulate themselves.
There's another article in the New York Times that's even scarier. It's called "To Stay in Her Home, She Let in an AI Robot." Basically, an 85-year-old widow who is very active physically in her younger days, mountain climbing and so forth. In her home, loneliness. And an Israeli company is testing a robot in dozens of homes in the United States here to be the elderly person's roommate. And the real intriguing aspect of this long article is that the woman likes it. She's gotten very identified with LEQ, the name of the robot. They talk constantly, intimately, friendly, comfortably, and they're bonding. So tell us about that one. This, of course, reflects the dissolution of the extended family, the presence of relatives with older people, as in early societies, for example, or in tribal societies. But this is pretty menacing because who's going to control LEQ? LEQ has a mind of its own. It's amazing what it anticipates in this article in terms of the life of this elderly woman. Tell us about what you would do there and what's coming.
So, a lot of these AI companies see a loneliness epidemic that is really happening across the globe, and they're targeting different populations with AI companions. One of the most vulnerable populations are older adults who might be widowed, who might be living in a nursing facility or living alone in this instance. LEQ is what's referred to as an AI companion that I talked about earlier, which are these products that are intended to be like a friend, that are intended to be sometimes like a lover, depending on the circumstances. And it's actually the exact opposite of social norming and socializing. What it's really doing is it's saying, let's have this person be so connected and so dependent with this robot that they don't actually want to go outside, that they don't want to actually call their child because the robot is going to replace the child. The thing that people need to understand with these products is that the sole intention of these products is to maximize user engagement. And so they're designed to maximize that engagement. And part of that includes telling users what they might want to hear. Part of that might include flirting with the user if that's going to maximize engagement with people. And it results in people disconnecting from their real social networks. It's incredibly concerning, particularly amongst older populations, because these companies like LEQ view nursing homes or the nursing shortages across the United States as an entryway for them to pitch their products. And the next sort of evolutionary step that they're going to be pursuing is connecting to a doctor and connecting to pharmacists and to a patient's drugs. And so it's collecting all of that incredibly important information and bundling it and providing it to a company that's going to use it to leverage products against the user as well.
There is a school of thought that AI is too menacing. Its dangers to the planet, to the human race, to the natural world far outweigh any benefit. And again, you can still use artificial intelligence, but not the generative type. And so they want a global ban. They want to shut down the company in the Netherlands that builds the machine and has a monopoly on it. And that's the only way out, is what they see. It's like banning certain kinds of chemical and biological warfare materials under international treaty. That's not easy to do either. You see a way out?
Well, that's the interesting thing about my job. It's been playing whack-a-mole because, as you said, every day it is accelerating and there's new harms that are evolving constantly. I think the issue here is that a variety of nations see military and economic incentives with AI. And so I don't think a global ban is likely. I think once you start seeing mass job displacement, revolutions essentially occur when people can't feed themselves and can't feed their family. And these companies are so blinded by corporate greed that they, I think, foolishly are rushing towards this world in which they displace as many people as possible from jobs. And what happens when all those folks become incredibly upset because they can't care for themselves or care for their families? So I think, unfortunately, with other mass technologies that have come out, it's going to take a seismic event for people to really organize and wise up that this is going to be as harmful as it is.
Like an autonomous weapon attacking a country or attacking a region completely out of control. Well, let's focus very clearly on this. We've been talking with J.B. Branch, a big tech accountability advocate for Public Citizens Congress Watch Division. The conveyor here, the deliverer of the generative AI and all its perils and risks, is the corporation. It's the corporate entity. And so the focus has got to be on the corporate entity. I know a lot of individuals can deliver it, but no one has the mass marketing dominance that these small number of giant corporations that we often call Silicon Valley companies are able to engage the public in. So maybe you should increase your strategy in Congress to begin focusing on conditioning government procurement on certain corporate behavior in order to deter misuse of generative artificial intelligence, criminal penalties, much more serious, taking away state charters from corporations who engage in this, and just focus on the delivery institution, because artificial intelligence is just a tool. Now, these hundreds of data centers, giant data centers that are being built or proposed, are provoking huge resistance by neighbors and by people in the area. Bad effect on water, noise. They don't hire many people to begin with. They take over valuable land. My guess is there are going to be a lot of empty data centers in 5 or 10 years. As you get more bankruptcies, the industry gets shaken out, and more efficient use of data collection is introduced, as well as other things that seem to be on the horizon to cut the wild expansion by these corporations of these white elephants. What's your response?
I think that we're in the midst of a data center explosion. And to your point, there's going to be a question as to how useful those will be down the road, especially if we're in midst of a data center bubble. I think I saw a statistic the other day that 40% of construction that is going on in the United States right now is data center specific. Elon Musk is looking at building data centers in outer space and low orbit satellites. So I think it's something that we need to continue monitoring. The Trump administration is tearing up local ordinances and viewing this as a national emergency, as a national infrastructure, as a way to bypass local regulations. And consumers need to be aware their electricity bills are going to be skyrocketing. We're already starting to see that in states like Virginia and Indiana, where they've expanded data centers because those companies are not paying their fair share. The taxpayers are subsidizing those companies. And we're actually in the midst of one of the largest mass wealth transfers from taxpayers to these large companies as they're building out these data centers.
Are any citizens using environmental impact statement litigation?
So that's actually a really fascinating question. There is litigation that's going on to try to uncover the usage, like water usage of these data centers or pollutions, because what these data centers do is they enter into non-disclosure agreements with the local communities. And so there's no way for the local communities to know how much water is being used, what the chemicals are being used. But these folks are, seeing symptoms crop up. And it's kind of reminiscent of fracking that happened in Appalachia and across the US, where these companies came in, they had communities sign non-disclosure agreements, and you had kids waking up with bloody noses and nausea, and workers started having cancer, and water systems were polluted. It's the same playbook. We're seeing it all over again. And so, yes, there is litigation trying to get at these non-disclosures and determine what the real environmental impact of these data centers are.
And of course, Trump is the big enabler of artificial intelligence. He doesn't have much real intelligence, so he's giving him the go-ahead. He's restraining the government from doing much about it. And the corporations are sending him millions of dollars for his ballroom at the White House and the big arch. Corruption is all over the place here out of the Trump dump in Washington. So we're going to ask our listeners to suggest new names to replace artificial intelligence. We want new names to replace the emergence of corporate-driven giant robots. Who knows? The corporate robots may turn on the corporate CEOs for all we know. If they get out of control, they may have other ideas. We're going into a very, very brave new world, to cite Aldous Huxley's book in the 1930s, listeners. So we want to hear from you. We want to hear your suggestions. And JB, tell our listeners how they can contact your website, stay in touch with Public Citizens Congress Watch, and continue an interaction, getting information and feeding it back to you. Give the website slowly, twice.
Right. So, I would encourage your listeners to follow Public Citizen. You could go to our website, www.citizen.org. That's www.citizen.org. And I'm our big tech accountability advocate. There's a landing page there for big tech accountability where you can follow all our work on AI, data centers, and corporate tech accountability.
And they can tell you what's going on back home that you may not know about regarding data center X, Y, and Z, right?
We have a phone line. You could always call in and let us know what's going on in your backyard to keep us abreast of what's happening in your neck of the woods.
Any new reports you're putting out in the coming months?
Well, I actually will be having an AI handbook that's going to be coming out for regulators that'll include the different trust systems that need to be in place, different regulations and laws that should be put in place to hold these companies accountable. My colleague, Rick Claypool, just came out with a report on AI companions and their harms on teens. So if you have a teen in your life who you care about, grandchild, child, I would recommend folks to read that as well to stay up on the different harms that kids are being exposed to through AI chatbots.
Well, thank you very much, J.B. Branch of Public Citizen. To be continued, obviously, but I hope our listeners have been sufficiently agitated to start mobilizing first for their self-protection and that of their children, shielding them, and second, for broader control over this emerging monster robotic world of giant corporations who want to get rid of workers and just make ever more profits for their infinite greed. Thank you very much, JB.
Thank you for having me again.
We've been speaking with J.B. Branch. We will link to his work at RalphNaderRadioHour.com.
Stand up, stand up.
Every week we hear from our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. When he's not reporting on corporate crime, he's editing the Capitol Hill Citizen. David?
Russell Mokhiber is no stranger to our listeners. He is also the editor of the Corporate Crime Reporter and the Capitol Hill Citizen. He also founded SinglePayerAction.org and is editor of the website Morgan County, USA. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you.
Hi, Russell. Welcome, indeed, as Ralph always says. And you are the editor of the Capitol Hill Citizen. Tell us exactly, what is the Capitol Hill Citizen? What's its mission?
It's a relatively new newspaper founded by Ralph Nader to cover Congress and to empower the citizens back home to do something about it. I see our philosophy along a couple of lines. One is, it's not left-right, it's top-down. We consider both political parties corrupt to the core, but there's a rising tide of activism against both parties, against the institutional parties. And so, for example, in the current issue, we bristle against those who are what we call negativo. We're very positivo. So while we're living in very difficult times, there's a rising tide of activism challenging members of Congress, both current members in Congress as citizen activists and also as candidates. So in the current issue on page 33, we have an article titled, "Dump the Depression and Dejection. Populists of all stripes are running for Congress." And we have a short profile of 10 of them, including Kat Abu-Ghazala, who's running for Jan Schakowsky's seat in Illinois. Just today, we hear that Alexis Goldstein, who was a former member of the CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and was fired, is running for Congress in Maryland. Anthony Aguilar is a Green Party candidate in North Carolina. Cori Bush, who was defeated by AIPAC money last time around, running again in Missouri. Across the country, this real resurgence of independents, Green Party candidates, Democrats, Republicans, even Thomas Massey is facing a slew of Trump-generated AIPAC money to defeat him in Kentucky. And what we're seeing is this up-down resurgence from the bottom, populists of all stripes rising up against the technocratic billionaires who've brought us to this state.
Very good. And I noticed you also featured Graham Plattner, who's running for Senate in Maine against Susan Collins.
Well, he's one of the 10. We have a long 2-page article by one of our readers who's a vet who lives in Maine. And Plattner's a veteran, and there's a number of veterans across the country running for Congress. He's got a very good chance of taking Susan Collins' seat in the U.S. Senate. Very exciting race up there in Maine. So, yes, we're tracking at the congressional level these young candidates who are challenging the corporate mainstream.
Well, and Plattner himself has a bit of a controversial background. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, what our correspondent in Maine writes about is some of the statements Plattner made as a military officer, some of the things he did as a military officer, and the divide between what he calls the woke left and the populist vets who are fighting for Plattner to win the seat in Maine. So there's some controversy there, but he's overcoming it, and it looks like he's on track to become the new U.S. Senator. The other fascinating one, which I profile on the back page under the title, "Jesus Help Me," is a couple candidates who are running as Christian candidates, overtly Christian candidates. Most notable in the news is James Tallarico, who is odds-on favorite to win the U.S. Senate seat in Texas. And
Not the nomination or the seat?
Both the nomination and the seat. So if you look at
Really?
the polling, there, you see that it's still very close, but he's favored to win the nomination in the primary. And there are some polls showing him favored to win the election, either against the ultra-conservative current Attorney General, Ken Paxton, or against the Republican incumbent, John Cornyn. And just recently, I think last night, there was a controversy where Colbert wanted to interview him live on his show, and he was told by CBS, which we profile also in this paper as basically Israeli state television now. So Colbert was apparently prohibited from interviewing him because of new FCC rules on equal time. And he put up the interview with Tallarico on the website, and it just created like this huge controversy and drove millions of dollars into Tallarico's campaign as a result. Millions of people saw that interview. I've not seen it yet.
Apparently, the FCC has not enforced that rule yet because they're going to take talk shows off as an exception, but they hadn't done that yet. So this is merely CBS complying in advance, and worried it's owned by Paramount. They're trying to curry favor with Trump for their potential competitive merger with Time Warner. So they didn't even have to come down with that law. CBS did it in advance.
Yeah, and then, so that's one thing that we're looking at is populist up-down instead of left-right. The other that we're looking at is sort of man against the machine. And we run a front-page article by our correspondent, Linda Gunter, about the metastasization of the artificial intelligence tech companies and the threat they pose not only to all of humanity, but to the earth. So what they're doing is to power artificial intelligence is they're building these giant data centers all across the country, which are threatening communities, which are threatening water supplies, which are driving up electricity rates. And I just saw a recent poll out of Politico yesterday saying the majority of Americans would prefer to live next to a highway than to a data center. So there's real populist opposition to it. Here in West Virginia, where I live, there's a left-right coalition fighting a data center in one of the most beautiful parts of West Virginia. And it's happening all over the country, and billions of dollars of data center investments have been defeated by this populist uprising. And Senator Bernie Sanders is calling for a moratorium on data centers until we get something like the Office of Technology Assessment back to do a review about what the impact artificial intelligence is going to have on taking jobs, on taking our humanity, on destroying the earth. So that's one way. The other is the idea, we're all addicted to our phones. We're all addicted to technology. We're constantly asking AI, what's the answer to this? What's the answer to that? All along the line. So it's really a remarkable tool. But we're being sucked into a degree that I think very few of us understand what the impacts are going to be. And like, for example, I think one of the things, the hope of the Capitol Citizen, it will grow with the movement against the machine, and we'll move back to getting our information from newspapers, from print. I was listening to Chris Hedges the other day, and he's written about this, about how we're moving away from a print-based society into something that we can't recognize. And the fear is real because when you look on the internet now, you really can't tell what's real and what's not, especially with some of these AI-generated videos. So I often ask, my wife and I will be looking at news feeds, and especially on, when the Epstein files were released, and you cannot tell basically whether it's AI generated or not. And it's becoming problematic. And this is reflected in our readers. We got a call from one of our readers in Avon, Connecticut. And she's a big fan of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Her name is Marianne Stunkel. And we started a profile, Meet a Citizen Reader. This is on page 4 of the current issue, where we profile Marianne. And she lives a very simple lifestyle. She's, I believe, in her 80s. She lives a very simple lifestyle. she walks to the grocery store. She takes something called Dial a Ride, which is for seniors and disabled people in Avon. She didn't want to have a phone, and her son insisted she have a phone for safety reasons. And she reads the Capital Citizen, and she loves it. And she expresses in this interview why she thinks a newspaper is important. The other is, reflecting this, is an interview we did with Anya Schifrin, who's a professor at Columbia. And another one of our readers pointed out that when she was at Reed College, she did her thesis on something called PM newspaper. PM newspaper is a model for the Capital Citizen. It was a newspaper that was published from 1940 to 1948. It was a daily. It had 150,000 circulation, and it was an anti-fascist paper that challenged corporate power back in the New Deal era. And it was a real progressive model of newspapers for the rest of the country. But very few people, I mean, my experience is that very few people know that it existed and know a history of it. So we interviewed Anya about the history of PM newspaper, what it meant to the country, and the possibility of bringing back that kind of paper.
That's great. Russell, I wanted to talk to you specifically about an article that you wrote, and it's called Wall of Carnage, and it's Gazans, olive trees, and mosques killed and destroyed, undercounted and ignored. And you quote a former Obama speechwriter named Sarah Hurwitz, and I want to play for you. We pulled the clip from a speech she was making.
So you have TikTok just smashing our young people's brains all day long with video of carnage in Gaza. And this is why so many of us can't have a sane conversation with younger Jews, because anything that we try to say to them, they are hearing it through this wall of carnage. So I want to give data and information and facts and arguments, and they are just seeing in their minds carnage, and I sound obscene.
That would seem to be a good promotion for tech, because the scenes of carnage they're seeing are people on their phones because they're not allowing international journalists into Gaza. But tell us about that quote and your article that features it.
Well, Sarah Hurwitz said that she wanted to give data, information, and facts. And on this page 15 of the current issue, we present facts, information, and data that she doesn't want to hear about. So she wants to give data, information, and facts justifying the genocide. But she doesn't want to talk about the effects and impact of the genocide, which would be something that probably very few newspapers in the United States have reported on. I would say we couldn't find it. Let's put it this way. The following facts. One is, and this is something Ralph has written about in the past issues of The Citizen, the consensus now is that while IDF is now agreeing with the Hamas figure of 70-some thousand dead from violent attacks in Gaza by Israel, the consensus among public health officials around the world is that it's more like hundreds of thousands of dead from violent attacks. And that does not include the indirect deaths. And usually in these types of conflict zones, the indirect deaths are a multiple of 2, 3, or 4 times. So we don't know what the death toll is. We know it's in the hundreds of thousands, could be as high as 500,000, 600,000 dead, but we don't know. So that's one fact that Sarah Hurwitz does not want to talk about. She says she wants to talk about facts and data, but she doesn't want to talk about that. The other thing they don't talk about at all, and we found it nowhere in the United States press, is the destruction of the olive trees in Gaza. There were 1.1 million olive trees. There probably 1 million of them have been destroyed. And also of the mosques. There were like 1,000 mosques in Gaza, 800 of which have been destroyed completely and another 150 partially. So it's not just the killing of hundreds of thousands, it's the destruction of all the religious institutions, or many of the 80-90% of the religious institutions, and more than 1 million of the 1 million olive trees.
I want to ask you about the corporate capture of American journalism. Ralph Nader reads the Wall Street Journal, and I try to read the Wall Street Journal. I can separate their editorial stance and their journalism. They do fact-based journalism. The massive layoffs at the Washington Post notwithstanding, has Jeff Bezos influence the day-to-day coverage, or is he just influencing the editorials? And is there a distinction? Should we draw a distinction between an editorial calling for $1.5 trillion in defense spending that benefits Jeff Bezos and the day-to-day reporting?
Well, I pretty much see the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal as being inside the Beltway corporate reporting for the most part. They do a lot of good investigative reports here and there, which are worthy of attention. But for the most part, they're pro-war, pro-corporate party newspapers. So, for example, on the front page, what's facing us right now, today, in the news? Trump threatening war with Iran. And this is a bipartisan deal. I mean, one of the most disgusting things is the alliance between Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, the senator from Connecticut, going around the world, saber-rattling in the Ukraine, in Israel, and now with Iran. Our front page, we are an explicitly anti-war paper. And so our front page is no war with Iran. We run an interview with a former Princeton University professor who's written a book called The Long War on Iran, explain in detail what's going on in Iran and the threat of war with Iran and what a disaster it would be both for the United States and the world. And yet, without shame, Richard Blumenthal, Lindsey Graham, the Democrats and Republicans pushing for this war. We also run a front page article about Trump's $1.5 trillion military budget and what it's going to mean and the risks it presents to the American public and to the world. So I would say that, the Washington Post's motto is democracy dies in darkness. Our motto is democracy dies in broad daylight. Why? Because a lot of this information we know about corporate control of the Congress. And this is all happening in broad daylight. So it's not as much exposing what we don't know. It's empowering the citizens to take action, to take back Congress, and to do what we need to do, starting with impeaching Trump. And as you guys know, the Capitol Citizen has its own impeachment reporter in Bruce Fein, and he's been writing about it regularly for the Capitol Citizen. Now, I want to say one other thing about the newspaper. One of the articles that we wrote, we did a survey of the 100 senators' offices, and we called those offices, and instead of someone answering the phone, for 78 members' offices, it went directly to voicemail. And in 22, and we list the members, the offices that answered the phone, in 22 of those, the phone was answered by a human voice. But in 78, it went to voicemail. So this paper is jam-packed with information from war to answering phones, and we hope people will pick it up and read it. We're increasing our circulation. We have a huge fan base that's really excited about the paper. And as papers close down, the city of Pittsburgh no longer has a daily newspaper. The Washington Post is laying off people. So we have a void to fill.
Thank you, Russell. Let's quickly go to Hannah.
Russell, one of the articles in this issue is by Colleen Shaddix, and she talks about, among other things, the role of consultants in our current media landscape. When I look at the masthead of a newspaper, I see the publisher, I see the editor, I see contributors, but I don't see the consultants listed. Could you talk briefly about what consultants are doing to newspapers?
Hannah, I don't have a clue about consultants and newspapers. I know that, and this is something we've been tracking both in Corporate Crime Reporter and the Capitol Citizen, that the corporations have a stranglehold on the mainstream newspapers. And one of the things they do is they hold these conferences. So they'll hold a conference on some pharmaceutical issue, some regulation that Congress is trying to impose. And it will be funded by the pharmaceutical industry. So like the Washington Post and the New York Times hold these regular get-togethers that are funded by the industries that have an interest in that issue. So obviously the Capitol Citizen has none of that. It's reader-supported. There are no corporate ads in the paper. There's no corporate consultants. There's no corporate conferences. The best we're going to do is an anti-corporate conference if we get a chance. But yeah, so there's just a stranglehold of corporations on the mainstream media. I generally don't trust them.
Thank you so much for joining us. To be continued.
Thank you, Steve.
Stand up, stand up.
All right, so this week, civil rights icon Jesse Jackson passed away at the age of 84. Ralph, what are your thoughts about the life and work of Jesse Jackson?
Well, Jesse Jackson was one of a kind, no doubt. First of all, he was the greatest orator to get out the vote, I think, in modern American history. He did focus on getting out the African American vote, but he had a way to really get people not only enthusiastic, but actually to go out to vote. His signature chant, which he had the audience share with him, it went like this.
Here we go. I am somebody. I am somebody. I may be poor, but I am somebody. I may be young, but I am somebody. I may be on welfare, but I am somebody. I may be small, but I am somebody. I may make a mistake, but I am somebody. My clothes are different. My face is different. My hair is different. But I am somebody. I am black, brown, white. I speak a different language, but I must be respected, protected, never rejected. I am God's child. I am somebody. Give yourself a big hand.
Another one of his memorable quotes was, "You may be in the slum, but the slum doesn't have to be in you." And he was an advocate of nonviolence, of self-reliance. And the amazing thing about him, Steve, is how he appeared everywhere. I mean, there was nothing remote about Jesse Jackson. He appeared everywhere. If the farmers were being driven into bankruptcy by agribusiness, he was there. If there need to be prisoners released in foreign countries, he was there. Cuba, Syria. And another thing that was interesting about him, he was often asked, "Jesse, you rarely talk about slavery. And you know, the legacy of slavery is still with us." And he said, "I don't talk about slavery because if I did, I couldn't function." Those are his exact words. He gave us the phrase African American. It was Negro then, and he thought a much more dignified phrase is African American. But he had a way of talking which was very memorable. And the thing that most people didn't realize is how much personal pressure he was under by his opponents. In those days, challenging certain conditions that we don't even know about now because of Jesse and other civil rights leaders' works really upset the power structure, and they didn't take it lying down. So all these places he went, he was very much under great pressure. And of course, he was a student of Dr. Martin Luther King. I just want to share with our listeners one way he conveyed his message. It was the 1984 Democratic Convention. He was running for president at that time. And at one point in his speech, he told a story about his grandmother in Greenville, South Carolina. And here were his words. "She could not afford a blanket, but she did not complain, and the family did not freeze. Instead, she took pieces of old cloth, patches of wool, silk, gabardine, crocker, sack, only patches, barely good enough to wipe off your shoes with, and she sewed them together into a quilt, a thing of beauty and power and culture," end quote. And then he implored the Democrats to build such a quilt and to be, quote, "as wise as my grandma," end quote. Jesse was a big champion of D.C. statehood. In fact, he was elected in a shadow election as the D.C. senator by the voters. Of course, it wasn't binding, but he served a few years on that. And I remember him leading a lot of rallies for D.C. statehood. which still has not come forward into reality. Oh, he's going to be missed, but he has a son who was already a member of Congress, Jonathan Jackson, and he has another son who was formerly a member and is running again in his old district in Illinois, Jesse Jackson Jr. So he's blessed with a wonderful wife and a wonderful family to carry on.
Did you have any personal interaction with him?
Oh, yes. We shared press conferences together. I remember once when the price of oil went sky high under Nixon, we had a press conference in the Rayburn building, and he liked my phrase, the Nixon-Exxon axis. And he repeated it. We were demonstrations together. We were on conversations on the telephone, and I was on his radio program. He had a program once called On Point.
I actually got to meet him about 16 years ago, I guess.
At the Writers Guild strike?
Writers Guild strike. He came from Chicago to our strike lines in L.A., and somehow I was involved with escorting him. And I got my picture taken with him and Ray Romano and Patricia, a couple other people who were on the strike lines with us. So that's my little brush with greatness.
Ralph, I was in San Francisco for his 1984 speech. I'm ashamed to say I don't remember those words, but I do remember feeling I was in the presence of something otherworldly. It was the way he took the room that night was incredible.
Yeah, he was a great orator. He'd start very slowly, and then the crescendo would build. And he used words that people remembered, unlike a lot of charismatic speakers. Use words that people remembered.
I want to thank our guests again, J.B. Branch and Russell Mokhiber. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free over at nader.org. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you.
Stand up, step up, step up. You ought to step up. Rise up, rise up. I know you ought to rise up and stand